I think the next step is to ask Alan Winters from Dfid, as a discussant, to offer his own views on the report and its contents.
Okay, thank you very much, Arthur. So it's always a pleasure to come to ODI to discuss work, and particularly a big substantive piece of work like this. I find myself in agreement with a very large amount of what Rohit and Karen have said, and so I'm not sure that I can promise you a great deal more insight, and certainly not any fireworks. As far as Dfid is concerned, we have as one of our pillars guiding Dfid's activities economic growth, and now relabeled as wealth creation by the new government, but it's fairly much the same sort of thing. And we see competition policy as being one of the elements that contributes towards long-run efficiency and, in the end, long-run growth as well. The importance of contestable markets, sort of an investment climate that makes people able to contest and wish to contest, is really a very important part of unleashing the private sector as a tool for development. And in the end, jobs and incomes are basically generated by the private sector. Competition is always a very fine thing for other people. Most people don't like it when we apply it to themselves, and I'll say a little bit more about, as well, we're all an interest group, it seems, when it comes to competition. And there's a strong case that competition generates innovation as well as static efficiency gains. There is some of the literature suggests that it may be that in some cases competition drives a whole multitude of small firms into essentially sort of small scale and low technology approaches, whereas generating some rents might generate innovation. But to the extent that that is true, and by and large I think those cases have tended to be overstated, it's been much more in terms of high-tech sectors which have required extremely large investments, rather than the sort of innovations that we're typically going to see in low-income countries. So we see this as an area which really has a great deal to contribute, and to contribute a very low fiscal cost, which is quite important these days, towards growth and dynamism. It's not, however, the only job of competition and competition policy to stimulate growth. Issues of welfare and equity are also an important part of competition. These large monopoly profits that, at least in one or two of these cases, this report has identified, are essentially ways of redistributing income from small, possibly poor consumers towards large firms. And so not only are we interested in having competitive markets as a way of stimulating activity, but also of addressing at least some of the questions around welfare and equity. Now, I'm not an expert on competition policy, and nor am I particularly an expert on the sectors which Karen and Rohit have used. But I guess my feeling is that this is a fairly special set of four sectors, which is not in any way to say that they're not legitimate subjects for a study, but they are probably, certainly I would guess three of them, areas where we would expect competition policy to have a very large role. I mean, a priori, this is the sort of place that we would expect to find competition policy. Beer and cement are a pain everywhere. I've never come across an economy. If one reads histories of any economy developing, I mean the British economy included, in say the 18th and 19th centuries, the brewers are right there, big, influential, making profit. So brewing is always sort of number one really on sort of the competition list. Cement also to a very large extent, big, heavy industry, intimately connected with procurement and so on. So these are it's encouraging to see that some developing countries are getting to grips with them. But that's, in a sense, where we would expect some of the big wins to be. It's also the case that mobile telephony is an area where competition policy, in the sense of regulation, has been a real object lesson to us. Go back 15, 20 years, it looked like a natural monopoly. Copper wire, landlines and so on, and we just didn't really know what to do about the telephone industry. Very difficult to regulate, very difficult to control. Mobile phones, mobile telephony has changed all of that and changed it in a dramatic way. But every country, just about every country, got into mobile telephony with a set of regulations that were suited to landlines. And, sort of monopolies, very, very intrusive regulation, and so on. And what we've seen over the last 10 years is this sort of marvellous object lesson that when the technology changes dramatically, there is a huge, huge amount that you can do by having entry into that market, by relaxing the regulations so that one can get value-added products and so on. And so again, absolutely not to take anything away from the study, but again, it's a place, one of the places where I think we've had our eyes opened, in fact, to the importance of these sorts of issues. Sugar is also actually a fairly special sector. The Vietnamese government really decided to use sugar as a way of getting out into the regions. It was a sort of distributional policy, very heavily managed. And again, think about Britain. Sugar is an industry that is not unknown to the competition authorities. So I think these are very important cases. The one thing which they don't do for us, in a sense, is say, and therefore competition policy is fundamental throughout the economy. And I don't want to deny that, but I guess what I would say is that there are at least some sectors where, in a sense, having the government keep out of the way is probably as good a competition policy as you need. Now, I think the set of countries that they've studied is very interesting, and I think the idea of covering the same sectors in the same countries is a nice methodology, and I do think that that set of contrasts is very important. So what are the lessons that I've taken away from this? I'm afraid they're pretty much similar to the authors, but let me just sort of run through them and maybe give some of them even more weight. The first is the private sector is very good at addressing issues of technical efficiency. Private sector's really good at focusing on costs and getting costs down, pretty good on the whole at innovating to find better ways of doing things. And the example in the sugar industry of extremely low costs but very high prices essentially is a reflection of private management of the cost base. And that is quite an important issue. Technical efficiency is certainly not the be-all and end-all of economic management, and it's probably not the real issue in a sense. Well, the other issues are larger. But to recognise that creating competition, having the private sector think hard about costs, is an important part of attaining efficiency. It seems to me is one of the lessons that we get out of here. The second lesson, Karen emphasised this at the end of the presentation, but it also struck me, and I think there are plenty of examples in the report. I mean, government in general is quite often the problem, as well as possibly being the solution, or possibly not. As Karen has pointed out, governments very often like to share the rents of non-competitive practice. Indeed, go back into the medieval period, and governments got by selling monopolies. It was actually one of the ways you raised money, was to sell a monopoly. And so it's a really big trade-off for a government to make when it's privatising something. Privatise it in one lump, a nice big monopoly, somebody will pay you a lot of money for that. Or privatise it in lots of small groups which will compete and only earn normal profits. And that's a real trade-off for them. And as I think the authors have shown, there are many, many other ways in which governments are attracted to some of the things which a wise monopolist serves up their way. A monopolist who is playing for the long run knows that he has to share some of the goodies. It's also the case, however, that governments are sometimes inadvertently the problem, and that is a question of regulation, possibly of procurement, and those are cases where indeed, in a sense, debate and pointing out the issue with luck will get things addressed. It seems to me that one could have an extremely useful rule for government policy, and that is any government policy that doesn't promote competition rather than hinder it is almost certainly not going to be right. The government should ask themselves about everything they're doing. What is this doing for competition? And in some extremely high percentage of the time, the answer will be if we're not promoting competition, we're probably not doing as well as we need. Now, a competition authority, Mr. Samper made this point, the authors have made the point as well, competition policy authority needs to be able to comment on government. If it is only allowed to comment on private sector abuses, then it's only doing half its job. And one certainly does come across competition policies around the world that are shackled in that way, explicitly or more often implicitly, because the politics are so difficult. They choose not to comment on issues where, in a sense, we can very obviously see that competition is being distorted by governments or government policies. So the politics of competition policy authorities are extremely delicate. And it does seem to me that that's a lesson for a lot of us who offer advice. Competition policy, I suspect, is one of the areas where it really is possible to do harm if you get it wrong. I have often thought that no competition authority is better than a bad competition authority. And I worked for a period in the 90s in Eastern Europe, and talking with some Eastern European governments in the very early 90s about what a competition authority should do made one wish to say, no, just forget it, don't bother, no, it's okay, we'll come back to it in 5 years' time. Now, I think how does one address the sort of political issues? I mean, one of the things, of course, is it does require very high-level commitment by a government that it wants to see competition. But it also, I think, goes back very much to the point, again, that Mr. Samper made and the authors have made, that advocacy is an important part. Competition policy is not something in the broad that you can do beneath the horizon. The authority has got to be seen to be a player, got to be seen to have views, and willing to share them, both on sort of in a general debate in public, but on specific issues that are referred to them or come up, but also general advice on policy stances. And I think the idea that one has to build up constituencies and actually work to keep those constituencies alive is quite an important one. And the constituencies are both consumers and firms who are, what should we say, not dominant incumbents. Fourth of the lessons that I was interested in was that there are indeed international aspects of competition policy, particularly for small countries. I mean, think about the size of a number of the African economies. It's not surprising that a lot of competition issues are ultimately cross-border. And so one does need to try and find a way of tackling them. That might be a matter of cross-border cooperation. It might be a matter of some sort of regional competition authorities, which has the added attraction, I would have thought, but also the added complication that it raises the competition authority above any individual government. A regional competition authority with some teeth is an infringement of the sovereignty of a government, and governments rather like sovereignty. So I do think that there's an important question there for us as development scholars to think, how do small and poor countries cooperate on the issue of competition policy? I should say, however, that I'm no big fan of bringing competition policy into the WTO. On the whole, while international cooperation in competition policy would be a fine thing, the set of issues which the WTO alighted on in the good old days of the Singapore issues was generally exactly the set of things one didn't really need so far as developing countries were concerned. Finally, on the international side, as a trade scholar, this is what you'd expect me to say. Of course, trade policy and free trade is one of the, in a lot of cases, will be one of the simplest and most obvious ways of running a competition policy. Even a monopolist faced with an effective import sector has to toe the line and price at round about the import border price. And I think the Zambia sugar case is an example of that. You've identified a number of restrictions on imports, and hey presto, we've got a very efficient firm with very high prices. And that really looks to me as if one would get a long way towards it, maybe not the whole of the way, but a long way towards addressing that just by liberalising on the border. Trade policy, of course, is not the only thing. You need to make sure that trade can be effectively addressed, and so one needs to make sure that part of opening up trade to disciplined domestic companies is to ensure that transactions costs are not artificially high. The World Bank had an extremely interesting study, I thought, of transportation in 5 corridors in Africa, published last year. And that certainly suggested that in West Africa and to some extent in Central Africa, not very much point building extra roads. Roads were not the problem. There were quite enough roads for the restrictive transportation, the trucking sector that you had. And that until you were willing to grasp the nettle of addressing competition in the trucking sector, actually there really wasn't an infrastructure problem. The minute you had a trucking sector that wants to do the work, then you might need to think about roads. But until that point, it was hardly worth bothering. And I think that's quite important. Finally, industrial policy, since Karen slipped it in at the end. Industrial policy and competition policy are not necessarily quite the same thing. But I guess I would go back to sort of the rule that I advanced earlier. Government policy ought to be pro-competitive. And industrial policy that encourages competition, and indeed industrial competition that permits industrial policy that permits competition between sectors, so that it is rather even-handed in terms of providing facilities that allow firms to exist and so on. It seems to me, is not likely to go so far wrong as our past elements of industrial policy have done. So it does seem to me that competition is a necessary part of an industrial policy, not, I would add, sufficient. I still think that I would draw the bands more narrowly than just any policy that encourages competition would do. So, my congratulations for an interesting study, and those are the 4 points that I took home.